Mass disappearances are by no means a new phenomenon. The most well-known ones are the lost colony of Roanoke or the mysterious disappearance of the Yuba County 5. And there are other mass disappearances out there that are just as chilling. Number 5. Anjikuni Lake, sometimes known as Lake Anjikuni, is in Nunavut, Canada, and spans an incredible 197 square miles. The area is known for caribou, trout, pike, and Arctic graylings, and was once home to a small village that found itself in the middle of an unexplained disappearance. Fur trapper Joe LaBelle was making his way through the Canadian wilderness in November of 1930, trudging through the harsh and unrelenting conditions, and desperately seeking shelter. That's when he remembered that he had encountered a small village just off of the Anjikuni Lake earlier in his travels. As LaBelle approached the village, he noticed that something wasn't quite right. As the gray skies began to darken, he carried on through the village, looking for any sign of life. As he continued into the village, he found no one around. It had been completely deserted, but LaBelle was unable to find any obvious reason as to why. As he explored further, he found empty huts with half-eaten meals still sitting on the table, and one hut had a fire that had slowed to a smolder. Everything in the village was intact. Personal belongings were found in the huts, and there was no sign of a struggle. The village looked like all of the residents had simply gotten up and walked away, leaving their possessions behind. The village's dogs had also been left behind, and upon closer inspection, LaBelle found that some had starved to death, even though there was an abundance of food. Not wanting to stick around in the village, LaBelle walked to the nearest telegraph office and sent a message to the RCMP, urging them to investigate the mass disappearance of the Anjikuni village. The next morning, the RCMP arrived at the village and discovered that all of the graves were empty. The bodies had been removed and headstones had been placed into neat piles. Undamaged kayaks were found on the banks of the river, along with food that had been hung on lines to dry. One trapper and his son reported seeing a cylindrical bullet-shaped object in the sky that was headed for Anjikuni Lake. RCMP officers who were sent to investigate the village also reported seeing a bright blue light pulsing in the distance before fading away. The officers commented that it was too bright and artificial to be the northern lights, and were still unsure as to what exactly caused the lights that day. The RCMP commented that the people of the Anjikuni village had been missing for around 8 weeks by the time they were discovered by Joe LaBelle. They also said that they're still unsure of what exactly happened to the Anjikuni village, and are no closer to solving the mysterious disappearance of the people that inhabited the village all those years ago. Number 4. At a point in history, World War I, or the Great War as it was known back then, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, claiming the lives of 20 million people, plus countless others. On August 12, 1915, the Sandringham Company would make history and leave fellow soldiers and historians scratching their heads. Was this a case of a mysterious mass disappearance, or something else entirely? The Sandringham Company was established by King Edward VII in 1906 with the help of Frank Beck, a land agent. Beck worked closely with King Edward to establish the Sandringham Company of Volunteers. This force was comprised of people from the Sandringham estate such as gardeners, farmers, and King Edward's personal staff. When King Edward passed away in May of 1910, his reign was transferred to King George V, who pleaded with Beck to not sign up for the war. However, Beck went against his wishes. The company prepared themselves for combat, and they were drafted into the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. August 12, 1915, was the Sandringham Company's first mission as a unit, and Sir Horace Proctor Buchan ordered them to charge into the forest and attack the enemy Turkish forces. When Sir Proctor Buchan turned around to check on them, they had simply vanished into thin air. Bewildered, Sir Proctor Buchan began a short investigation, thinking that perhaps all of them had been captured by Turkish forces or had died in combat, but he found nothing. He ordered his men to search the area. However, the bodies of the missing company were never found. They were also never documented as prisoners of war by the enemy, and had simply vanished without a trace. Sir Proctor Buchan reported to his superiors, saying, quote, "Among these ardent souls was part of a fine company enlisted for the King Sandringham's estate. Nothing more was ever found or heard of any of them. They charged into the forest and were lost to sight and sound. Not one of them ever came back." In 1965, Frederick Reichard, a veteran, testified that the Sandringham Company's mysterious disappearance was linked with the supernatural. His statement was supported by 3 other veterans who told newspapers that on August 12, 1915, there had been 8 loaf-shaped clouds hovering over the forest where the Sandringham Company were launching their attack. According to Reichard, he wanted the Sandringham Company to march into one of these clouds, and about an hour later, the cloud mysteriously rose, taking the company with it. Historians were quick to debunk this theory, and no further links to the supernatural have ever been made in this case. The company's families were simply told that their loved ones had disappeared, and lived in hope that they may one day return. Over 100 years later, we're still not sure what happened to those men, making this one of the oldest cases of an unsolved mass disappearance. Number 3. On April 18, 2007, in Queensland, Australia, a helicopter pilot came across a boat named the Cas 2, drifting near the Great Barrier Reef. The helicopter pilot immediately noted that something was amiss and speculated that the crew of the boat were possibly in danger, as they had drifted so far out into the ocean. In turn, the pilot alerted the maritime authorities in Queensland, who began their rescue effort of the Cas 2 and its crew. It wouldn't be until April 20th that authorities were able to successfully locate the Cas 2, and upon boarding the boat, they were met with a disturbing scene. The 3 crew members on board, 56-year-old Derek Batten, 69-year-old Peter Tunstead, and 63-year-old James Tunstead, were all missing, but nothing else on the ship seemed out of the ordinary. John Hall, who worked for the Queensland Emergency Management Office, said, quote, "What they found was a bit strange, in that everything was normal. There was just no sign of the crew." The sail of the Cas 2 had been shredded, but other than that, the ship was in good condition. When authorities boarded the ship, the engine was still running, and a half-empty cup of coffee, along with other valuables, such as a laptop and clothing. Nothing on the ship seemed out of the ordinary. There were no signs of a struggle, and the men had plenty of supplies to last them throughout their trip. Radio and GPS systems were intact, and no life jackets were missing from the boat. The 3 men had simply vanished without a trace, and investigators were left puzzled. The 3 men had departed from Airlie Beach on April 15th, and were intending to sail to Townsville, Queensland, before going on to other destinations. The 3 men were by no means experienced sailors, having had minimal experience in their newly acquired Cas 2. Derek Batten had taken a sailing course, but Peter and James had very little experience on ships and were learning as they went. Numerous searches were conducted by the Australian Search and Rescue, as well as the Australian Navy, but despite their efforts, they were never able to locate the 3 men. In August of 2008, Michael Barnes, the Queensland State Coroner, held an inquest into the mysterious disappearance of the Cas 2 crew. Barnes concluded that the men were no longer alive, and that they'd been involved in some sort of accident, but were unable to definitively prove what happened to the men that day. Barnes stated that, quote, "I cannot be so definitive about the circumstances under which the event occurred. He further proposed that the three men encountered trouble while trying to hoist up their rope, causing them to fall overboard. This is the official version of events. However, others are skeptical and believe that something else came into play. Until the bodies of the three men are found, it's unlikely that we will ever know the truth. Number 2. The Dollhouse disappearance is regarded as the only mass disappearance in Swedish history, and despite occurring 56 years ago, it remains a heavily discussed case in Sweden to this day. On July 29, 1965, Gay Carlson, Jan-Olof Dahlso, and Kjell Johansson mysteriously vanished after being seen driving a blue Volvo PV444 out of Gothenburg, Sweden. From the start, the details of this case are bizarre. None of the three men had a driver's license, and the Volvo belonged to Dollhouse's brother. It has never been stated whether they had his permission to use the car, though. Another unsettling detail is that the three were headed for a town just south of Gothenburg to go on a camping trip. However, sources have stated that the weather on July 25th was in no way suitable for camping, with low temperatures and heavy downfall. After July 29th, the men were never seen or heard from again. The three men were reported missing individually and at different times. It would take authorities months to make the connection between the cases and realize that the three men had disappeared together, by which time valuable evidence had been lost. Sources claim that the three men had been involved in petty crimes in the past. However, they'd made an effort to set themselves on the straight and narrow in recent months, getting themselves jobs at the local shipyard. But investigators found no reason for the three men to disappear voluntarily. Their wages had not been collected before their disappearance, and Johansson had recently had a baby, giving him all the more reason to return home safely. Coincidentally, on July 29, 1965, there was another mysterious disappearance in Gothenburg. 18-year-old art student Hubner Lundqvist was last seen by his family on the morning of the 29th at their summer home. According to his family, he was making his way to Gothenburg as he was interested in connecting with the local artists there. They received a postcard that simply read, "All is well, don't worry," and that was the last time they ever heard from him. Swedish authorities have never conclusively said whether the two disappearances are connected. However, it is a bizarre coincidence to have two disappearances on the same day in the same city. They say that bad things come in threes, and on July 29th, that was no exception, as along with the two mysterious disappearances, there was also a bank heist. Two Hungarian refugees had fled to Sweden following civil unrest in Hungary, and they stormed into a bank demanding that the teller hand over money. Thankfully, a customer was able to wrestle one of the robbers to the ground, causing him to shoot himself in the leg. The two men, plus an accomplice, were later captured and arrested after making away with about $18,000 in the local currency. Again, Swedish authorities have not commented on whether this incident is linked. However, it is rather creepy that three major incidents happened on the same day. There's also another bizarre twist in the case. When Gay Carlson disappeared, his sister went to his apartment to search for him. Upon opening the door, she was greeted by an unfamiliar man. The man was wearing a jumper that she had made for her brother, and she also noticed that the man was acting bizarrely. He appeared stressed or panicked and told her that she should look for her brother in the pub district before closing the door. Since then, there have been no updates to the case. However, there have been a few possible sightings. In the late 1960s, two Swedish sailors came forward and reported that they'd spoken with a young man who told them he was an art student. They reported seeing him in Singapore and Australia. These sightings are, of course, unconfirmed, and until further evidence is brought to light, the only mass disappearance in Swedish history will remain unsolved. For over 66 years, the fate of the MV Joyada has been a mystery, And even in 2021, we are still no closer to solving the bizarre mass disappearance of its crew. On October 3rd, 1955, the MV Joyada left Samoa headed for Tokelau, a dependent territory in New Zealand. The ship was due to reach Tokelau on October 5th. However, it never arrived, and soon after, a search and rescue team was assembled to find the ship. For 6 days, the search and rescue team searched a combined distance of 100,000 square miles, but found no sign of the missing cargo ship. On October 12, 1955, the search efforts were abandoned, and hope began to fade of ever finding the ship or its crew. That was until November 10, 1955, when the MV Joyada was found over 600 miles away by Captain Gerald Douglas, who had just headed out from Fiji. He was making his journey when he came across the ship and made contact with the nearest port, informing them that he'd come across a badly damaged ship and that it was likely the missing MV Joyada. The ship was tipped heavily into the water and was almost completely submerged. It was also found that a cooling pipe had burst and begun to slowly flood the boat, with experts later claiming that a cargo ship such as this was more than capable of handling such flooding and would have remained afloat. Captain Douglas set about recovering the ship in hopes of saving any remaining crew on board. However, there were no signs of the crew. Despite searching the ship thoroughly, no crew members or their bodies were found. It was noted that 4 tons of cargo was missing from the ship, and the onboard radio was tuned to a frequency that was used as an international marine distress channel. When the ship had set off on October 3rd, it had been in a state of disrepair. However, the official inquiry did not list this as the reason for the crew's mysterious disappearance. Experts are still unsure as to what caused the crew of the MV Joyada to mysteriously vanish, and it's still a debated topic to this day. Let us know in the comments if you think you know what happened to the MV Joyada. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.